What's up, guys? Alexander here with Date Psychology. So today I'm going to do a video for you on a recent paper, a review of the relationship between marital satisfaction, or I should say relationship status, long-term relationship status, and mental health. But we'll talk about satisfaction as well in this because it's an important part of the picture. So going forward, this is the paper that we're going to look at here, Romantic Relationships and Mental Health from 2017. So pretty recent, covers some big meta-analyses as well. I'm going to just kind of go through the results with you. So we know that long-term relationships are associated with better mental health, right? But we don't necessarily know why. We have some ideas. One of these is the selection hypothesis, okay? And that's people who have better mental health are more likely to get into relationships, right? Why is that? It makes it easier to form a relationship when you are in a good position of mental health, doesn't it, right? Someone that suffers from major depression, maybe they're not even going to be able to form a relationship. When they get in the relationship, they might have some problems. And then we have the experience hypothesis, which is that being in a relationship itself is good for mental health, right? You're having positive experiences in the relationship, social, emotional support, and that is helpful for your mental health. So two different explanations. They're not mutually contradictory. Both can be true. Important. There is evidence for both, right? In cross-sectional research, we see that previously good mental health, right? Someone who had good mental health to begin with, more likely to get married in the future, longitudinally. So we see an association in the cross-sectional research between good mental health and being in a relationship, and between that and relationship satisfaction. Additionally, we see that relationship quality predicts better mental health outcomes. So people who have better relationships also have more positive mental health, right? If the relationship goes bad, mental health declines. And there you have some evidence for the experience hypothesis, right? Kind of a causal effect, like the relationship went down and so mental health declines along with that as well. We know from past research that mental health has a moderate to, a moderate, I should say, small to moderate correlation with genetics, okay? It's heritable. Mentioned in this paper, past research looking at mental health and using twin studies has found genetic or heritable contribution between 21-31% of the variance, right? Explained for depression, suicidality, alcohol use, a bunch of other things that didn't go into this paper as well. Many personality traits, antisocial personality traits, all of that sort of a thing. So mental health, heritable. But we also see that being married explains a large part of the variance, right? Even more, 60 to 64%. So marriage, very protective for mental health, it seems. So we have these potential models that I mentioned, right? The selection model. And what is that? Basically, that earlier mental health predicts later mental health, and earlier mental health predicts being in a relationship. And so what does that cause? It causes what's called a spurious correlation. If you run a correlation between relationship status and later mental health, you will see a correlation between the two because there's a third variable causing it, right? Even though the correlation is not causal, it's caused by a third variable, also called the third variable problem. And then in the experience model, we see a bidirectional relationship, right? Where romantic relationships impact mental health, and mental health also impacts romantic relationships. So being in a romantic relationship, good for mental health. Having a bad relationship, bad for mental health. Having bad mental health, bad for the relationship. What else do we see? The marital discord model, right? And that's the idea that if you are in a relationship, conflict leads to depression, okay? Leads to poor mental health outcomes. And then at the same time, stress generation model, basically the opposite, right? That poor mental health leads to conflict. And again, these aren't mutually exclusive. The two effects can occur at the same time, but they're different models for explaining kind of what we see going on. We see associations with relationship satisfaction and mental health, right? And these are pretty high, that when relationship satisfaction is high, you don't have poor mental health outcomes, about 0.42 for women, 0.37 for men. So there aren't large sex differences here, even though relationship satisfaction for women does decline more over time and more quickly over time. We also see, mentioned in the paper, that a 12-month period of marital satisfaction increases the odds by about 2.7 of experiencing a major depressive episode. So if you had a predisposition toward depression and you're in a marriage that's going poorly or something like that, yeah, it can make it a lot worse. Subjective well-being is another measurement used across all the research on happiness, basically. And it's also kind of associated with, so you can look at the relationship between subjective well-being and between mental health and between relationship satisfaction, right? And so this is a trait that's actually very, very, very stable and very independent of circumstances, which again is kind of contrary to our folk psychology, right? Kind of contrary to the way that we often think about mental health in general, is that bad things happen, so you feel bad. Well, your well-being is pretty stable, and of course when bad things happen, you do feel worse for a time, but it returns to a baseline very, very, very quickly. Okay, so relationships actually stand out here a little bit, because being in a relationship or not actually does shift subjective well-being more than a lot of other things in life. So half of the variance in the relationship between these two, between being in a relationship and SWB, can be explained by selection. People that have a high well-being, they go into relationships and they do better with them. And then half by experience, that being in a relationship makes you feel better. And so there's been a lot of discussion recently about, the loneliness crisis, people being single. And certainly this is something that people who are involuntarily single for periods of time will tell you. They're like, I'm unhappy because I'm not in a relationship. Yeah, I mean, the research does support that, if you want to be in a relationship and you're not, yeah, that can make you feel worse on a day-to-day basis over an extended period of time. The correlations here between subjective well-being and relationship satisfaction also, they're about 2 to 4, so small, moderate, whatever. But important, recent research has actually shown stronger correlations. And that might be because fewer people are getting into relationships, or people are taking their relationships, they're more selective about relationships maybe, so you don't see as many poorer relationships in that sense. Also kind of related to, the small decline in divorce rates. A lot of people think divorce is like way up, maybe if you compare it to many, many decades ago, but people are getting married less, so the divorce rate also down. So that might be why we see in recent research that there is this larger relationship now between subjective well-being and relationship quality, right? What else do we know about this subjective well-being? So it usually returns to a baseline, as I mentioned. But as I mentioned, relationships can impact this more than a lot of other environmental variables and experiences. And given that, we also see some interesting things with it. One of those is that after a divorce, instead of returning to the original baseline, the baseline may be shifted down a little bit, right? So now your new baseline is a little bit lower, and people do tend to recover over time regardless following a divorce, but it's typically a little bit longer before they kind of return. And another one, a widower after the death of a spouse. These are things that kind of stick with someone a longer period of time, and they take them longer to return to baseline, or they shift the baseline down, and that's kind of their new baseline. In a sense, worst case scenario, they never truly get over it. So a quick summary of this. I guess we're doing a very, very short video today. The relationship here between this is bidirectional, okay? So it's not just one thing or the other. It's not I'm sad or unhappy or I have poor mental health because I can't be in a relationship, and if I had a relationship, everything would be perfect. That's probably not the case, Not being able to get into a relationship at all, it is closely related to behavior and personality and all of that. Despite the extent to which people say everything is looks or looks whatever, we know that many, many behavioral traits, many personality traits, many different variables, however you look at them, are associated with the likelihood of entering a relationship. So we know it isn't just your face, okay? But at the same time, we do know that mental health issues limit people from entering relationships, and so do other issues of neurodivergence that are not like depression, right? That are not what individuals might think of as a mental health problem. An example of that is autism, that individuals with autism often have difficulty finding and forming relationships. Then when individuals get into relationships, if they have some kind of neurodivergence, if they have some kind of mental illness, depression, whatever the case may be, their relationships may suffer for that, right? So this is very important, because it's not simply like, oh, if I could get into a relationship, I would feel great and my life would be better and everything would be fine. That's probably not what's going to happen, because relationship satisfaction also matters, not just relationship status. Most of what we looked at here is an associations with relationship satisfaction. Being in a terrible relationship in many ways is worse for you than being alone. So being alone is not, the big fear, and it might not always seem that way for individuals who have really struggled to form relationships and who have been very, very isolated, especially for young men and women who are often very lonely at that age, and that are going to be much more likely to be single than older individuals who have had relationship experiences. They may feel incredibly isolated, but at the same time, if you've been through some bad relationships, you'll find people out there who have, and they'll tell you, I would rather just stay single forever than ever experience that again. So you have these two different perspectives on it. But the point is that a romantic relationship isn't going to fix your mental health. It's not going to solve it, but it is associated with it, specifically if you have a good relationship, right? So not being in a relationship in that sense as well, we could understand it to mean that it probably is damaging to mental health. We are a very social species, right? We evolved to be extremely cooperative. We talk about human nature often. Is man good or evil? That sort of a thing. Human beings are one of the most pro-social and cooperative mammals that there are, right? We engage in very systematic acts of violence. Of course, war, we're very good at that because we're very intelligent relative to other animals. I'm sure, if a tiger could do it, maybe it would also. But we engage in extreme levels of cooperation, just going through the motions on a day-to-day basis. We seem to love to be around other people. Most people do. And of course, there are individual differences here, in introversion, extroversion. But being isolated entirely and not having contact with other human beings, not having any friends, not having any romantic partner, it's probably not, the way that the human mind has evolved to work. And because, as I mentioned in the past video, because reproduction in humans may be secondary from the evolutionary perspective to a desire for love, companionship, and all of that. And I'll explain what I mean by that, okay? And I've used this example too much now. I'm going to use it again. So a salmon, the fish, it has an instinct to swim up the river and fertilize some eggs. That's it. Human beings don't seem to have as strong of an instinct to reproduce. What do humans have? A desire to have sex. They feel lust, feel love, right? A desire to touch other people, a desire to love and not be alone. But those lead to sex. So those are evolutionary adaptations that facilitate reproduction. Right? That's how we do it. The salmon just knows and it swims upstream and squirting its stuff on the eggs, and that's the salmon. But that's not how we do it, right? We have these desires that precede reproduction and facilitate it. But those are emotions in us now that, wherever they came from in the evolutionary perspective, they're there now. They're needs that we need to fulfill. You've seen something like Maslow's hierarchy, right? The pyramid. And you see, that pretty early on in that, it's like, okay, yeah, like love, right? Companionship, something like that is supposedly part of that. So people feel pretty bad when they aren't able to do that. And yeah, of course, that can contribute to poor mental health. But at the same time, poor mental health makes people behave in ways that make them in many ways undesirable as romantic partners, that make them unfit as romantic partners if they get into a relationship. And I got a lot of trouble. I didn't get in real trouble. I just got a bunch of woke people that got mad at me on Twitter for saying this. But basically, that individuals who do have mental health issues, if they're not getting picked in a relationship, the other people that are not picking them, they might be making a decision that's like smart for them, right? If you think about someone with major depression, very severe depression, and they can't get out of bed, so they lose their job, and they don't brush their teeth every day because they're so depressed. They have no libido because they're so depressed, and all of that. Then is that going to be a desirable person to have a relationship? No, they're probably not going to go out and date very much, so they're much more likely to be single. If that happens when they're in a relationship, they might find that their partner loses attraction in them very quickly as well. You get a lot of problems like this with mental health in relationships, and it's not very fair. And people that don't understand mental health and psychology very well, that look at things through a very political lens, they might be saying like, oh, that's super unfair, right? That's, how can you stigmatize them? That's very ableist or whatever. But the fact is, attraction to other people, it's not very PC, right? It doesn't really care about something like that. There's a lot of very non-PC things, politically correct, right, about who you're attracted to and what traits you like, and it's not always going to be like fair and egalitarian and that sort of a thing. So people that suffer from mental health issues, people who may be neurodivergent and all of that, they may really struggle with relationships, and it isn't their fault at all. You know, and if I say, okay, you know, you can see why other people do not pick them, that doesn't even make, it's not even a moral statement that means, for example, like, yeah, you deserve not to be picked or you deserve to be alone. That's not what anyone is saying at all. We're just simply saying we know what things people find attractive in romantic partners relatively well. And we know what things make relationships function over time relatively well, right? And we know that different kinds of mental health issues get in the way of that, okay? And that's just, you know, a description of things. I'm not telling you the way that it would work in the ideal society utopia, right? I'm saying this is the way that it has probably worked since time immemorial, and based on what we know about attractiveness. Let's go on to the very last slide here. This one is basically a summary of the two models that we looked at, kind of incorporated into one. So what do we have going on here? Okay, we begin with relationship or mental health before the relationship, right? Good or bad mental health. There's, boom, we're just going to call it that. That determines if you enter a relationship or not. So the arrow up, right, to relationship status. And then that also determines your relationship quality. So you have relationship status, relationship quality. Okay, your relationship quality determines if your relationship is good or bad or not. And it determines if you have stress in the relationship, right? Because even if you have a bad relationship, if you have very resilient mental health, you might not react as much. So those two things lead to poor mental health. In addition, you have the mental health that you started with. And so what's the effect here? As I mentioned throughout this, it's bidirectional, that being in a relationship will determine some mental health outcomes for the better or for the worse. And your mental health ahead of time will also determine if you get into a relationship at all and your relationship outcomes. So I hope that this all made sense, guys. Short video. Like the channel, subscribe, hit the bell, all of those things, and I will make another for you very soon.